So how does that relate to the topic of civil rights conservatism? Is it entangled with that in some ways, or maybe just explain with or without a segue of kind of how you came to this as a topic of interest?
So I've always studied ideology, where it comes from, how it changes over the course of time, how it gets deployed in the context, especially of social movements on both the left and the right. So some people have thought it's odd that I've, written a book about liberal left labor activism in Detroit from the 1930s to the 1960s. And I wrote a book about the rise of conservative political thought among African Americans, Latinos, women, homosexuals as populations that kind of, start to gravitate towards the new right, especially in the late 70s, early 1980s. And people were like, wow, that's really odd. I'm like, no, it's just ideology. I'm
Yeah.
really kind of, fascinated about how it functions. And so now for the first time, I'm trying to write at the intersection. So the book, which I think I'm going to call A Different Shade of Freedom, tries to make an argument about interconnections, parallels, intersections between the post-World War II civil rights movement and the rise of the new right. And it argues that they're not as separate and as polarized as we like to think, and that there's a whole murky middle there involving people and organizations that would allow us to think in a much more complex way about the relationship, the interrelationship, the entanglements between the two great post-World War II civil rights, social movements, political movements in the United States. So, for example, one of the things that I've been writing about lately is C.O.R.E, the Congress of Racial Equality, one of the nation's oldest civil rights organizations, founded in the 40s. They did the first freedom ride in like 1947, right? I mean, it's a really old, established organization. By the 1980s, they've become a right-wing front group, right? And so, how does that happen, right? And for them, it was through an engagement with Black Power. And so at one point in the book, I argue that the new forms of Black conservatism is one of the enduring legacies of the Black Power movement, which is not an argument that anybody really wants to hear.
Well,
but super interesting, right, to kind of think about it and to again think about these moments of entanglement.
You think of Black Power relative. You sort of think and again, might be some sort of gross oversimplifications here, but I think in the popular imagination, you think Martin Luther King is sort of the more centrist liberal approach to, like, let's do this in a nicer, nonviolent way, and maybe Malcolm X is more like farther left. You kind of almost think of like the Black Power movement as being farther left than some of the more mainstream civil rights movement. And so it's surprising to hear that this group, through an engagement with what you maybe popularly is perceived as a farther left approach, ends up finding its way right. How does that happen?
That's right. I mean, people like Roy Innis, Floyd McKissick. So a number of the people involved in C.O.R.E, as leaders and members, end up, pretty far to the right, ultimately. Through arguments around community control of organizations, or the need to have Black-led organizations, or things for Roy Innis in particular, gun rights. So he hates gun control. He thinks gun control is just a conspiracy to de-arm Black people and make them vulnerable.
The Black Panthers walked around with machine guns, right? As a way to,
In fact, the iconic photo, right, of the Panthers on the lawn of the State House armed, they were there to protest gun control legislation. Or, kind of the things that were going on around schools. They were against integration and busing because they didn't want Black kids to be sent to white institutions. So the argument is that these things skew left and right politically in really complex ways as they get played out. Right? And the book kind of talks a lot about what I call a sort of everyday Black conservatism. That sits somehow underneath or alongside of these other ideological tendencies, and that this stuff can be inflected all kinds of ways across a political spectrum. The other great example that I love is James Meredith.
Yeah, yeah.
One of the icons of this. People misunderstood what James Meredith was doing in 1962. 1963, when he desegregates the University of Mississippi, becoming the first acknowledged African-American student there. After a legal battle, a riot, I mean, it's just, it's a major civil rights cause. He's a deeply conservative figure who believed in desegregation for exceptional individuals like himself, not necessarily integration for everybody else. I mean, it just wasn't kind of what he, what he was really doing. And that doesn't become apparent until the new right sufficiently desegregates itself to allow space for people like James Meredith, who then, kind of goes on a sort of long journey further and further right. He works for the North Carolina conservative Senator Jesse Helms in the 1980s, and then campaigns for the ex-Klansman David Duke in the early 1990s, and says that he's doing it because their policies are aligned. They're both against the liberal welfare state. So again, right?
You don't see movies about that kind of art.
No, right? Again, these are not stories that people really want to know, that they want to hear, and so we stop histories. We stop biographies of people like Meredith at a certain point. Once they kind of cross some line where it's just more than we want to know, right? We want to kind of freeze them in that eyes and the prize moment, that heroic moment.
Yeah, that's where the credits roll.
That's where the credits roll. The history of C.O.R.E. just stops. I mean, you would think that the C.O.R.E. didn't continue to exist after a certain period. So the book is about that too, about our unwillingness to know certain kinds of stories and to embrace certain kinds of histories. Another part of the book, I claim to be writing an ideologically wide history of the civil rights movement. So yeah, it's been interesting.